Welcome to the book of John, chapter 6, verses 1 to 15. Jesus feeds the 5,000. The number of the word that we will be featuring in this section is number 4396, the prophet, and the participles will be marked by their parsing rather than having it solid purple. It begins in chapter 6, Metatavta apilthen o Isus peran tis thalasis tis Galileas, tis Tiberiados. After these things, Jesus went forth on the other side of the Sea of Galilee, the one of Tiberias. We have a map here, and here is the Sea of Galilee, and Tiberias is a city here on the coast. Capernaum, Bethsaida over here. Mount Meron, as we'll see a little bit here, how Jesus goes up into the mountain, which I believe is Mount Meron. When we get to that part, I'll show it to you. But this Sea of Tiberias, there's 48,000 people that live today in the city of Tiberias. It's also called Chinnereth in Numbers 34:11, Joshua 13:27, other places. Also the Lake of Gennesaret in Luke 5:1, and it's the lowest freshwater lake on earth. It's 700 feet below sea level. It's 13 miles long by 8 miles wide at its farthest point. So Jesus is now going on the other side. Whatever side that is, we don't know because it doesn't tell us where he's starting from. But he went on over someplace on this sea. In verse 2 it says, Ke ekoluthi avto oklos polis, and there followed him a great multitude. So somehow these people are going around finding Jesus and following him wherever he goes. The there underlined should have been italicized. It will in the 4th edition, which I'm making progress on. I finished the New Testament, and I'm now in the book of Joshua. And it continues, Oti eoron avtu ta simia a epi ton asthen nunton. There's our first participle. It's present active. The ones being invalid. They've seen the signs that he did in his healing people. We went through signs already in John 4:46. You can go back to there and see all about the signs. And invalid was in John 5:1 to 18. We go through what invalid is all about. So basically he had healed all these people, and the people were following him now, either to be healed or to find out, see what signs he's doing. So and then verse 3 it says, Anilthe they is tooros o Isus, ke aki ekathito meta ton mathiton af tu. And Jesus went up into the mountain, and there sat down with his disciples. The mountain, I believe, as I mentioned, was Mount Meron, about 10 miles northwest of the Lake of Galilee, where in Ezekiel it talks about a future temple being built on the high mountain with the water going into the Lake of Galilee. It could only be Mount Meron. And Mount Meron is a place, I believe, also where the transfiguration took place, where Jesus changed appearance and Moses and Elijah appeared with the disciples being with him. In verse 4, in the agis to Pascha. Now it was near the Passover, Eort ton Iudeon, the holiday of the Jews. Eparas un o Isus tus ophthalmus. And then Jesus, having lifted up the eyes, ke theasamenus oti polis oklos erkete prosavton, and having seen that a great multitude comes to him, 5,000 we find out, legi proston Philippon, he says to Philip. Philip was the fourth disciple that was called by Jesus. John 1:44, it says, the next day he wanted to go forth into Galilee, and he finds Philip. And Jesus says to him, follow me. And so Philip lived in Bethsaida, it says. That was the city of Andrew and Peter. He's probably a fisherman, and he had probably been listening to John the Immerser with Andrew and Peter, and Jesus finds him and calls him. And then later in 1:45 of John, it says, Philip finds Nathanael and says to him, the one whom Moses wrote in the law and the prophets we have found, Jesus from Nazareth. And you can go to John 1:45 and read that whole story of Nathanael then being seen by Jesus under the fig tree. In John 12:21 later, it says, when these Greeks came to talk to Jesus, it says, these then came forward to Philip, to the one from Bethsaida of Galilee, and asked him, saying, O Master, we want to see Jesus. Philip comes and speaks to Andrew, and again, Andrew and Philip speak to Jesus. So those are about the main places that Philip is mentioned. So what does he do? It says, Jesus says, Pothen agorasomen artus. From what place should we buy bread? To Philip. Ina phagosin uti, that these should eat. Tuto they elegate pirazon avton. But this he said, testing him, avtos gar idi ti emeli pien, for he knew what he was about to do. Testing, we went into that also in Matthew 4:1-11. We are all tested by God and by Satan. God tests us to pass and be with him, and Satan hopes for us to fail to be with him. So we are in a time of testing. That's what life is all about. In a giant test. From our birth to our death, we are in a test. In verse 7, apokrithi avto Philippos, diakosion vinarion arti uk arkusin avtis. 200 denarii worth of breads are not sufficient to them. He knew how much money they had. That's all they had. It's not enough to buy that much to feed 5,000 and more. And then ina ekastos avton vraki ti lavi, that each of them should receive a little. And legi avto is ek ton mathiton avtu, and says to him one from out of his disciples, Andreas, the brother of Simon Peter, Simonos Petru, esti pedarion en othi o echi pente artus crithinus. There's one boy here who has 5 breads of barley, kedio apsaria, and 2 fishes. Alatavta ti estin is tosutos, but these, what are they for so many? It was interesting, it talks about the barley bread. When I started studying this chapter, the man who lives with me, young man, he cooks and buys a lot of the groceries. Blessing from me. We pray all the time, and wonderful companion in old age. And I mentioned barley some reason to make barley, and he bought some barley and made barley. I would more or less call it barley chili. You don't have to use beans. You can use barley instead, and it makes a fantastic chili. So the breads, the barley, had a little bit of meaning to me. But in the Bible, it says that Isaac sowed barley in Genesis 29:12. And then the flax and the barley were struck in Egypt in Exodus 9:31. A cor of barley was worth 50 double drachmas, and an ephah of flour was brought to the temple or to the tabernacle when a man was jealous, thinking his wife had committed adultery. That's Numbers 5:15. Then Gideon, when he went down to the camp of the Midianites, heard these men talking, and the one man said he was dreaming, and a loaf of barley came down and hit the camp. And Gideon then knew that God was going to deliver up Midian into Israel. Ruth returned, it says, at the barley harvest in Ruth 1:22, and Absalom burns the barley field of Joab to get the attention of Joab to go ask his father that Absalom could talk to him again after he revolted, more or less. And then it talks about the miracle of the 20 loaves of barley by either Elijah or Elisha in 2 Kings 4:42-44. And 2 Chronicles 2:10, it mentions barley being used for trade and also for tribute to give to the enemies when you're conquered in 2 Chronicles 27:5. Now, in Ezekiel 4:12, God tells Ezekiel to bake barley over human dung. And Ezekiel, that's terrible. And so God relented and let him use the dung of an animal, which it's not unusual because I was reading in Mongolia, they have yaks, and yak dung is a common method of having a fire and cooking things on yak dung. Barley was a future sacrifice in Ezekiel 45:13 to be brought to the temple on Mount Meron, and the flax and the barley mentioned in Revelation 6:6. So, what are these? What's the barley and the two fishes? What is that? What is that for all these people? Ipe they oi sus, and Jesus said, Piisate tus anthropus anapesin, make the men to recline. In Mark 6:40 it says, and he gave orders to them to lie all down, parties by parties, upon the grass. And they reclined plot by 100 and by 50. So that's the way they were able to count the 5,000 here. And so it says, in the hortos polis into topo, and now there was much grass in the place. So apparently they went up towards Mount Meron, somewhere, a big field where all these people were able to lie down, and Jesus spoke to them. It says, and then anepason un eandris, then the men reclined. Ton arithmon, the number, osi pentakiskilii, was about 5,000. That's a lot of people, 5,000. I went to a mega church in Southern California. I think it had about 3,500, but 5,000 people coming to listen to Jesus. So he must have had something to draw them, and the signs, maybe the miracles, but maybe talking to them about things in their life, what matters most in a person's life. All sorts of things, the subjects that would have been interesting to see exactly what Jesus said to these thousands of people. Then verse 11, it says, Eleve they tus artus Isus, and Jesus took the breads, ke evcharistisas, and having given thanks, which is an aorist active participle, Viedoke tis mathites, he distributed to the disciples, giving thanks. I give thanks before I eat. With my companion, Weston, we both pray before we eat and give thanks to the Lord. And Jesus does it here. Ide mathite tis anakimeni, so the disciples gave it to other disciples. Jesus gave the food, and they gave it out to the people that were reclining. Omios ke ekton opsarion oson ethelon, in like manner also from the little fishes as much as they wanted. So the miracle of the loaves. And why is it a miracle? Because it says, os they and pleistheson, and as they were filled up, the people were all filled up, ate all they wanted, legitis mathites av tu, he says to his disciples, synagate ta perisevsanta klasmata, gather together the abounding pieces, all the pieces of bread that were on the ground, maybe pieces of fish, ina me ti apolite, that nothing should perish. So he makes all this extra food and wants to save it for other times. In verse 13, sinigagon un ke agemison dodecakophinus klasmaton ek ton pente arton ton krithenon a perisevse tis vevrokosin. So they gathered together then and filled 12 hampers of pieces from out of the 5 loaves of barley. So not only were they all fed, but there was 12 hampers full. They were probably fairly good size hampers that would hold this food. And they were all filled with the breads, pieces that abounded to the people. And then it continues in 14, eun anthropi, and then the men then, idontes o episa Simeon o Jesus, having seen what sign Jesus did, here's another sign, it's a miracle, elegon oti, said that, utos estin alithos o prophetis o echomenos is ton kosmon. This is truly the prophet coming into the world. Now, what prophet were they talking about? It says in 18:15, a prophet from out of your brothers as me, the Lord your God shall raise up, and him you shall hear. So Moses tells the people back in Deuteronomy that they're going to be another prophet as him, and him you should hear. You hear him. This is imperative that you would hear him. But things happened. It says in Deuteronomy 31:16, and the Lord said to Moses, behold, you go to sleep with your fathers, and rising up, this people shall fornicate after alien gods, and they shall forsake me, and shall efface my covenant which I ordained with them. So the portent of Moses saying that these people were not going to do the things that God would have. They're going to go after other gods. But it gets worse than that. In Deuteronomy 31:17, they give an excuse and they say, for the Lord my God is not among me, is why these evils found me. And I look at today and I see the Jews and Israel becoming a nation, but they don't believe in Jesus. And they're going through tough times, a lot of wars, and they don't recognize that God was among them and that he was rejected. In the rejection of Jesus Christ, which happens a little bit later here in the book of John. After that, we see in Deuteronomy 28:25, Moses' portent of the later happening to Israel, which says, and you will be in dispersion among all the kingdoms of the earth. Now, that's had happened after the death of Jesus. Before that, Israel was, the 10 northern kingdoms were dispersed throughout the world, so it could be referring to that. But Babylon was only one nation. But then after the Romans came, then they were dispersed throughout the world for 2,000 years after the rejection of God being with them. They didn't see it, didn't want it. And then God explains what's happening even today. It says not in Deuteronomy 9:5, not because of your righteousness, that is Israel, nor because of the sacredness of your heart to Israel, do you enter to inherit their land, people that they're going into in Canaan. but because of the impiety of the nations. These nations, the Lord shall utterly destroy them from your presence. And I look and see that's what's happening today. Israel is not a believer of God, doesn't believe in Jesus, and so the rejection of Christ, but yet God is using Israel today, I believe, not because of their righteousness or their sacredness, but because he is going to utterly destroy these nations that are going to come against Israel. And the nations are all mentioned in the 38th, 39th chapter of Ezekiel. So that is going to happen here in the near future, I believe. And then in Deuteronomy 32:20, it sums up by God, and he said, I will turn away my face from them, and I will show what will be to them at the last times. So the last times haven't occurred yet, so they're still going to occur, the last times. And with this generation, but it says, for it's a generation being distorted. They don't believe in the true God, Jesus. Sins in whom there is not belief in them. They don't believe in the prophet. This is what it's all about. The prophet that is going to come. He came, they rejected him, killed him, crucified him. Today, it's going to get worse, even though Israel has come back, I believe. And then in verse 15, it continues, and Jesus then, Isus un genos oti melusin erkase ke arpazin avton, Jesus then, having known that they were about to come and to seize him by force. And arpazin is the word where it talks about in Thessalonians, where the believers will be arpazo, a raptor, the raptor bird, the eagle comes down and just grabs you and pulls you up, and you're gone to be eaten by the nestlings. And so the seizing by force, they wanted to seize Jesus, not to harm him, but that ina peisosin afton vasilea, that they should make him king. They've seen all the things he's doing, and they realize at the time that he is the prophet. They want to make him the king. And then, but what happens? Palin anachorisan is to oros avtos monos. And again he withdrew unto the mountain himself alone. So he was probably down lower between Galilee and the mountain. So now 5,000 are fed, and all these things have gone on. They want to seize him, but yet he goes back up to Mount Meron, up to the top. You can go to Mount Meron. It's a nature preserve. There's a road, or not a road, a path that goes all the way to the Lake of Galilee, which probably was the path that the disciples and Jesus took. You can read about Mount Meron on Wikipedia. The next video, Jesus walks on the sea.